How do you overcome a traumatic experience? You know, we often think of trauma as something that only war veterans experience. But trauma can be experienced from a variety of setbacks, like a divorce or a medical condition or a financial collapse, certainly from abuse, right? This is part 2 in my brief series on post-traumatic spiritual growth. In part 1, I talked about the impact of trauma, and today I want to outline a process to recover from trauma. But first, I want you to know that this series is just an introduction to trauma, okay? Trauma is complex. So I'm going to share just enough information to help you recognize your trauma, give you some hope, and point you in the right direction to get the help that you need. Now, post-traumatic spiritual growth is where you are able to reframe your trauma and allow God to use it to actually move you in a new place in life, a place that you probably could never be if the trauma had never happened. For example, in my life, I experienced spiritual abuse, which set me back for a number of years. But out of that negative experience, I decided to start a church that help people to see the goodness and grace of God. Plus, I wrote a book about spiritual abuse that has helped many, many people. I never would have chosen the abuse, of course, but I believe God used it in my life to cause me to do things I never dreamed of doing before the abuse. So, what can you do to recover from your trauma? Well, I don't want to be simplistic. I don't want to imply that there are like 5 easy steps to recover from trauma. But let me give you an idea of some steps you can take so you can get some traction and move out of your pain, okay? First thing I recommend is to understand your trauma and appreciate what it's done to you, okay? Many people fail to see the loss of trauma, and they try to carry on with life like nothing's happened. They just suck it up and keep moving on, doing their best to ignore their pain or to kill it. For example, I see this with people who have been part of an abusive church. They might leave the church and think that finding a new church is the answer. But when they attend a new church, they often feel uncomfortable. They don't seem to fit in. And sometimes they'll be triggered by a song or a sermon or even a smell. They might experience a physical reaction like a shortness of breath. Maybe they'll perspire, maybe a full-on panic attack. These are signs that they might have PTSD, but they don't even know it. They feel guilty about it too, and so they just try harder. They pray more, go to church more, or whatever they can to try to fix what they feel is broken inside. So the first step to recovery is to recognize your trauma, and then once you recognize it, own it. In other words, take responsibility for it, because if you don't, no one else will. Don't play the victim card and let it ravage your life. To own your trauma, you'll need to seek some help. Find a good counselor. You want to explore what the trauma has done to you, and it's hard to do that on your own. You're too deeply enmeshed in your pain to see it. You need an objective perspective. And let me add that you want to find a counselor who is trained in helping people with trauma, okay? Besides finding a good counselor, it's important to find safe people. You know, many people don't understand trauma, and they can easily say things that trigger you and re-traumatize you. For example, spiritual people, unfortunately, can be very simplistic. They might tell you to just forgive, or just move on, or just trust God. Those things don't help, do they? In fact, they're very isolating, meaning those comments make you feel alone and like no one understands or appreciates you or your situation. And for that reason, it's a good idea to join a support group to connect with people who understand you and can relate to your experience. You need to disconnect from unhealthy people and make connections with healthy people, okay? It might seem selfish at first. People you know might feel rejected by you, but you need to be a little selfish if you want to recover. That's part of it. Next, you'll need to grieve your loss. You know, most people aren't very good at this. We tend to want to jump right to the healing part and getting on with life, but that will only frustrate you because the grief will haunt you until you deal with it. I encourage people to slow down and to reflect on all the losses from their trauma. Literally, take out a sheet of paper and write them down. You'll be surprised how many losses there are in your life. You know, we tend to minimize those losses, but I think healing comes when you identify all of them and then sit with them. Acknowledge the losses and what they've done to you. Feel the pain of the losses rather than ignoring it or medicating it. And then invite God into your healing process. Bring these losses to God in prayer and ask God to restore what was lost. I don't necessarily mean something tangible like you lost a marriage or you lost a loved one. You're not going to get those back. But you can ask God to fill up that space in you that feels the pain of loss. Next, it's important to forgive whomever it was who caused the trauma. That might be another person or yourself or even God. You see, if you hold something against someone for what's been done to you, that will only lock you into your pain. I'm not saying that you need to excuse an abuser. Forgiveness isn't excusing. And I'm not saying you need to be their friend either. No, forgiveness doesn't mean reconciling. Forgiveness just releases you and your offender from your anger. I've got a few videos on forgiveness on my channel where I expand on this, so be sure to check them out. The last thing I'll mention here is to be patient with yourself. Trauma runs deeper than you think. When I left an abusive church, it took me 5 years before I could start going to church again. At first, I felt guilty about that. I thought there was something wrong with me. And I've seen the same thing in other people who have experienced that kind of abuse. But as I prayed about it, I sensed that God was telling me that I was in a recovery process. It would take time for the wounds to heal. And that was okay. I felt like God was giving me permission to not attend church until it felt right again. And that's what happened. Well, I've got more to say about trauma and post-traumatic spiritual growth, but I've given you enough for today. So let me stop here. If you found this helpful, I hope you'll add a like to this video and share it with a friend. And be sure to subscribe to my channel so you'll be alerted when the next video comes out in this series. And that's where I'm going to define the benefits of post-traumatic spiritual growth. If you'd like to learn more about my books and other work that I do, visit my website at readingremy.com. Well, that's all for now, so bye-bye.